that the world situation is very serious. That must be apparent to all intelligent people. Under the arbitrary and destructive Nazi rule, virtually every possible enterprise was geared into the German war machine. If Europe's requirements for the next 3 or 4 years of foreign food and other essential products, principally from America, are so much greater than her present ability to pay, that she must have substantial additional help or face economic, social, and political deterioration. The remedy seems to lie in breaking the vicious circle and restoring the confidence of the people of Europe in the economic future of their own country.
Cat F. Welcome to World War II Live. I'm your host, John C. McManus, and that, of course, was the voice of General George C. Marshall giving a very famous speech at commencement at Harvard in June 1947 that basically unleashes what becomes the Marshall Plan. So, George C. Marshall, obviously we're going to be talking a lot about him tonight. Kevin Hemel, my co-host, is alongside. How you doing, my friend?
John, I am the Nixon to your Dick Winters.
Okay, I thought you were going a different direction with that, so I'm glad. I'm glad it was Lewis Nixon.
Not Nixon.
I think that was his name, right? Yeah. Good to see you. And, of course, alongside, as always, and spinning the dials, masterminding this entire incredible operation is our wonderful producer and chief of staff, Mark Festoso. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
Terrific.
Oh, terrific.
I have delved into my haversack. Isn't that a line from Patton where talking about his aides, and he goes, "I think your aides could delve into their haversacks and pull out the rank of the admiral of the Turkish Navy."
That is correct. Trust me.
Yep.
So I have delved into the oral history archive at the World War II Museum to find something to kick us off. And I found the oral history of Paul Lawrence, who served in New Guinea in World War II. But he also went to Harvard Business School after the war. And he was in the audience when Marshall was giving his speech. So I thought we would hear a little clip from him and what he had to say about hearing that speech to get you kicked off for tonight. Here we go.
Because we really didn't understand at the time what the kind of government that Hitler had created in Germany and Tojo in Japan and the other people there and Mussolini, and really understand the evil that was involved in that. I was at the Harvard commencement program after the war, where General Marshall came up and gave his speech that got the Marshall Plan started. So I felt I had close to some real history there, and I was very proud of what our country did with that effort to help rebuild Europe and establish post-war governments over there.
Yeah, I mean, that's really neat because there's a first-hand guy who's right there in the speech. I mean, we, all these late years beyond, we know a lot about that speech and what happens with the Marshall Plan. You don't hear that many first-hand accounts of people who were actually there listening to that particular, momentous speech.
Yeah, and John, I was thinking anybody listening in and wondering, like, who is that? I don't recognize that voice. Well, count me in, because I've never heard George C. Marshall speak either. I've read all of his letters and to all of his commanders. I've read multiple biographies on him, but he really was not sort of the face of the war. He was the architect of World War II, and he's so vital to the war effort, but he wasn't a man to stand in front of the cameras and give press conferences. In fact, I could be wrong about this, but I think he actually studied his own face, because he felt, if I walk out of the Pentagon and I'm smiling, people are going to think we're winning the war. And if I walk out of the Pentagon and I'm frowning, people are going to think we're losing the war. And so he studied to have this real poker face so that no one could get a read on, would interpret world conditions, if he had just gotten off a bad phone call with his wife or something. And he was acutely aware of all those things, but it was not a sort of, hey, let me tell you all a few stories. That was not his personality.
No, and and he really was the master of impassivity. I mean, he had been that way, you know, in terms of his personality his whole life, and he kind of cultivated that as an officer. He felt that he should be impassive and he should be emotionless so much as that's possible. And you know, you were talking about like a bad conversation with his wife or whatever. Well, Marshall had two wives, actually, and his first wife died under really terribly tragic circumstances in the late 1920s. And she had really serious thyroid problems. She had an operation that seemed to work, and she was recuperating and recovering, and she was about to get home from the hospital. And so she's writing a letter to George, and she basically drops dead in the middle of writing that letter. So he is in the middle of giving a lecture, I think at the Army War College.
Yep.
And he's pulled out of that, and, you know, they call him and tell him what just happened with his wife. And he has this moment of you know, emotion, as you can imagine, and then the mask of impassivity comes over him again. So if he can do that when he's just found out that his wife dies suddenly, imagine all the ups and downs of the war. I mean, he's very much wired that way.
And, you know, it really worked for him because at one point, as a young officer, he gets reviewed by his superior, which is how the Army works. And his superior actually wrote something to the effect of, you know, this man is a great leader, and I wouldn't mind following him at some point or serving underneath him at some point. I mean, that you don't see that, not only in the military, but anywhere that someone's willing to say, hey, this youngling is really so impressive, I would follow him. And John, just to follow up about his wife, you know, he basically becomes, you know, a widower, and he's very alone. And some people, when he's at Fort Myer, invite him over for dinner because they want to introduce him to this woman. I think she was also recently widowed. And they click like that, you know, and then the conversation is sparkling and everything. And he offers to give her a ride home. And so they're driving and talking, and he's turning left and right and everything. And finally she goes, hey, have you been here long? Because I think you're lost. We've been driving for a while. And he says, Madam, I know this area so well that I've been trying to come up with different routes so that we can keep talking. And that is going to become his second wife. And so it's a very human side of him you don't see. But I don't know that I have ever heard a bad word about George C. Marshall's tenure as the Army Chief of Staff. And just to be clear, there was no chairman of the Joint Chief back then. You were the Chief of Staff of the Army, but the Army is really the dominant force. And so he's not the most highest ranking person in World War II. That's actually Admiral Leahy. But it's really Marshall that is designing and figuring out how to win World War II.
Yeah, and they had created the Joint Chiefs of Staff at that point, of which Leahy was a part, and he was also Roosevelt's Chief of Staff, and, you know, had seniority to Marshall and whatnot. But Marshall then really, through a lot of the war, is dealing then with his inter-service peers. Hap Arnold, who technically, I guess, is under Marshall, but
kind of, you know,
realistically isn't, as the head of the Army Air Forces. And then, of course, Ernie King, who is quite a... quite, I won't say an adversary, but certainly an antagonist at times. And they had different visions of the war. And Ernie King, of course, is famously hard-headed, just a very difficult guy to deal with sometimes. And certainly he's looking more towards the Pacific, as much of the Navy was during the war.
Yep.
Marshall is one of the masterminds of the Europe First or Germany First strategy. But I would say, too, though, really, I think it's a tribute to Marshall of what a productive relationship he forged with these two really quite egocentric personalities on some level, much less also dealing with Roosevelt, with whom I think he meshed very well, even though they were very different kinds of people.
You know,
and Leahy was an excellent facilitator.
Yep, and when I think about with King, I think early in the war, Marshall missed a meeting with King and immediately sent him a note saying, hey, I am really sorry about this. I did not mean to miss this. And we cannot afford to fall into suspicions with each other or anything. What we're dealing with is so big here. I completely apologize. I mean, he nipped that thing in the bud like nobody's business. Like, hey, we're dealing with huge stuff here. I am not slighting you. I want to address this immediately. I mean, really smart the way he worked with people, you know.
Yeah, and and to his credit, Ernie King understood the relationship was important and kind of backed off of what was sometimes a pretty difficult personality. But what's interesting too is that Marshall would sometimes sometimes you would draw a line in the sand in a way. And a good example of that is that, of course, King famously hated MacArthur. And, of course, Marshall's in a really tough spot of having to deal with MacArthur because MacArthur technically has seniority over Marshall. He had been Army Chief of Staff when Marshall was a lieutenant colonel, for gosh sakes. And had really, famously tried to kind of destroy Marshall's career. And was always paranoid about Marshall or whatever. But Marshall dealt with him on a very emotionless and very professional level. And when he'd hear Ernie King talking about him, quite, badly, it would sort of irk Marshall a little bit. And in one meeting, when King was going off, Marshall basically pounded the table and said, "I won't have this hatred at our meetings."
Good for him.
And I thought that's a really important moment because I know probably, well, I don't know, but you would think Marshall didn't necessarily, like MacArthur a whole lot. He wasn't the biggest fan of MacArthur, as many folks weren't. But he also thought there was a bigger principle at stake there too, and he was willing to stand up to King to say, "Hey, let's keep this on a professional level."
Yeah, because it's this guy's got a whole theater to command. We can't fall back into our anger and hatreds and prejudices against each other. One of my favorite Marshall stories actually goes back to World War I when he was a captain with the 1st Infantry Division, and John J. Pershing comes for an inspection, and he's appalled by what he sees because, these guys have been living, hand to mouth basically, and he turns to the division commander and starts chewing him out in front of the whole division. And young Captain Marshall breaks ranks, marches up to the three-star general, right? I don't know if he was 4 stars at that point.
I think it was 3-star.
Yeah, to Pershing. And he says, "You can't talk to our division commander like that." And Pershing is just reeling, like, who the hell is this guy? And he says, we haven't had decent supplies, clothes, food since we got here. And Pershing is like, he goes, "Well, we have these problems at headquarters too." And Marshall doesn't even back down. He goes, "Yes, but we have them here every day." About face, goes back into the ranks. Everyone around him is like, "Well, he's getting sent home tomorrow." And what does Pershing do? He makes him his chief of operations. And Marshall will now plan the Battle of St. Mihiel, the first Army campaign of World War I. And the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the climactic battle of the U.S. Of course, not everything goes to plan, but he figures it out. And just what an amazing guy from an early age.
Well, he was, and so you can see at that moment, it's to Pershing's credit that he sees the larger value in Marshall, of course, too, but he really becomes Pershing's key staff officer in World War I. You can see at that moment that Marshall is a really good organizer and planner. I mean, obviously, the famous title of, I think it's Forrest Pogue's biography, Organizer of Victory, and that is precisely Marshall. He's an organizer. He is, as Army Chief of Staff, he has very good liaisons with Congress, good relationships with the people who are going to, fund the war and support it politically and all this. And the other thing about Marshall that I think really stands out in the long run, beyond how he runs things and organizes things, he's a really good identifier of talent.
Yep.
And of course, the famous Black Book or whatever, I don't know that really existed. I don't know what you've ever found.
I've never found anything. I've just
evidence.
Heard reference that it maybe might exist, that kind of thing.
I've never seen any evidence that it really existed, but I don't know that it had to, because I think Marshall, either on paper somewhere or in his head, had a kind of database of people he felt were really, very talented and were worth promoting. And he was, of course, to me, like any good officer who's going to rise to a senior level, no matter what generation we're talking about, kind of has to be a mentor to younger officers and maybe NCOs going forward. And I think Marshall took that to heart because he had been mentored by Pershing, who's a much more hardcore guy than the next generation will be. But Marshall comes out of that kind of school of hard knocks, understanding, who's going to be useful for what in the war to come. And obviously the most famous protege is Eisenhower.
Clark, Patton,
Bradley.
Who in the Pacific does he pick? Not MacArthur.
Not MacArthur, because he sort of inherits MacArthur. Eichelberger.
Okay.
Absolutely Eichelberger. Kruger on some level, though they're kind of peers too, because Kruger was a little older. Oscar Griswold is a really good example. He was the commander of 14th
What
Corps.
about who's the commander in
Terrific.
Okinawa, the Army commander that gets killed?
Buckner, yeah, I think Buckner is certainly a protege
Okay.
of Marshall's, and you know, at the kind of more junior level, Matthew Ridgway is one of his key proteges. And the interesting thing about that, Kevin, is that you see this meeting that takes place shortly after World War One, when Pershing was still chief of staff, and Marshall was his key staff officer. Ridgway at that point is an instructor at West Point and is also functioning as like the de facto director of athletics.
I was gonna say swim
they
club, all
needed
that stuff. Yeah, I've read about that.
everything, like, but especially football,
Okay.
you know. And so they needed Pershing's approval to have road games besides the Army-Navy game. And so Ridgway travels into New York City and meets in a hotel suite with Pershing and with Marshall. And so this is his first contact with Marshall. And so this is 3 Army chiefs of staff, if you think about it. Pershing, the present one,
Wow.
Marshall, the future one, and eventually Ridgway by the 1950s. And of course, then Ridgway renews his relationship with Marshall in China in 1926, that era, when they're both of the 15th Infantry. And that's when you really do see some pretty significant mentoring from that point forward. It's just one example. There's many others who come into contact. Beadle Smith would be a good example too.
And all I'm thinking is,
tons
damn, I wish I was in that meeting because I'd be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs right now if I had been there. Dang it.
I think for you it definitely would have worked. Yeah, that was the one thing missing in your Army career.
My resume. And John,
Your resume.
last pre-World War II question for you. Is it the fact that Marshall was on Pershing's staff that MacArthur did not like him? Is that the root of it?
I think it's more than that. I think that...
Or was it because he didn't go to West Point? Because he didn't.
Certainly there's a bias of that. But I think MacArthur, to his credit, was willing to look past that. I think when he'd see a good officer, I think there was a whiff of Europe first about Marshall from the beginning.
Right.
And I think in a way that's what stuck in MacArthur's craw, that he understood that Marshall was going to be a kind of a peer strategist and could become influential under some circumstances, and he really didn't like his strategic blueprint. I also think he didn't, MacArthur was pretty valorous in World War I as a combat officer, and I think he felt that Marshall did not really have those earn those stripes on the front lines, and that's true.
Yeah.
And you can understand MacArthur's viewpoint there, but so how did he try and sidetrack Marshall's career? He basically gives him a National Guard slot with the Illinois National Guard. This is in the 1930s, like the mid-30s, something like that. And so Marshall's a lieutenant colonel about to become a full colonel, but it really seems like a career dead-ender. And so one of the reasons why we know about all this view that MacArthur had of Marshall is that he would unload during World War II. He would unload his feelings to Eichelberger. And Eichelberger recorded all this and later discussed it about how he every now and again, like MacArthur would get in a mood of being paranoid about what they're doing in D.C. and he would blame Marshall for this, that, and everything, especially like knuckling under the Navy or whatever. And
then
so
Eichelberger would go on The View and talk. I'm sorry, go on.
Yeah, but he was okay with Meghan McCain, I think. But other than that, he had problems with the other hosts. But no, MacArthur would like turn on Eichelberger almost and say, that's George Catlett Marshall's doing. He would call him by his full name and like as if he was conspiring back in D.C. to sabotage everything MacArthur was doing.
Everybody was against MacArthur, and at least in his
MacArthur's
mind, right?
view, sometimes,
depending
on his mood, sometimes he was that way. He could be kind of paranoid. So I think, but I do think there was tension before. And yes, you're right. Maybe Marshall was a little too cozy with Pershing for MacArthur's taste. Maybe.
And what an amazing pick Roosevelt makes in choosing Marshall, because didn't go to West Point, VMI. I don't know anybody else who went to VMI that prior to him that rose to such levels. He's a major general when he gets
at that point. He was, I think.
There are so many people slotted ahead of him, just on seniority that deserve to get this job, and yet Roosevelt goes against all of that and picks a major general And like, what is it? The day he gets sworn in, Adolf Hitler invades Poland. Like, whew, just in time.
September 1st, 1939 is the day Marshall becomes Army Chief of Staff. Isn't that amazing?
Unbelievable.
And yeah, it really is. And you're right. He gets leapfrogged over, I think several dozen officers.
I know General
who had seniority
Drum was
over him.
angry that he felt he should be the shoe-in. I'm sure every general above him felt that. But I think everybody below him went, oh, my God, they actually made the right call,
I think most did. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. All those protégés who had lined up all over the Army, and we just discussed a few of them. There were many more, of course. And so, yeah, he was pretty well known. He was very influential, of course, through the Army school system, like the Army War College, the Command and General Staff College, Fort Benning at the Infantry School. Remember, he helps author that book of basically combat studies from World War I. It's sort of like, Combat Studies Institute now. It's that version of it in the 1920s and 30s, studying all these small unit actions, infantry, especially in World War I. And so Marshall was really quite scholarly on that level, too. So he had a lot of influence over people like Joe Stilwell. There's another good example I'd give you, who had been at the infantry school. And so he's kind of disseminated his views throughout the Army through these other protégés. And so I think by 1939, he's got a nice coterie of talent that he's going to draw on going forward, in addition to eventually these political connections that he'll have. And I think that'll kind of help give wings to his post-war career, because Harry Truman comes along when he becomes president. There's nobody he respects more than Marshall, because he's seen how he operates during the war, and he wants him as a Secretary of State, which he was. The snippet from the speech we heard earlier, Marshall was Secretary of State at that point. Eventually, he's going to be Secretary of Defense too. So, in addition, of course, by the way, to going to China right after the war to try and figure out the Civil War there. So he just really has his footprint almost everywhere.
And imagine Harry Truman's level of experience coming into the presidency, and George C. Marshall at that point in April of 1945. Truman understood, my God, this man is fighting a global war, and he's on my side. And every meeting, it's like, here I'm this brand new guy, and he's treating me like the President of the United States. And so good on Marshall. He could not have picked a better person to be Secretary of State, because no one understands the world condition in a lot of ways better than Marshall. Going through his letters, from 42 to 45, it's like, okay, we got to get, more bug spray to New Guinea, and we got to get some heavy winter boots over to Italy. I mean, every day he's looking at the globe and fighting the war on a global level like nobody else. He's
masterminding a global war.
Yeah.
I mean, and that, I make this point all the time, that really, there's no country really before or since that's ever fought a global war on that scale like the United States. Of course, Britain is in a global war. Yes, admittedly, the Australians, but I'm talking about at the level the Americans are fighting. So when you think about that, all these responsibilities that Marshall has, which is why I've always thought, I don't know how you feel about this. Let me see your opinion. I've always thought that the whole thing about Marshall commanding Overlord is a little bit of much ado about nothing, because that would have been a significant step down for him. And I know it's the biggest command in history and all that.
Right.
But
take it to the presidency.
I mean, it's still, you're running the whole global war versus being a theater commander to run the invasion of Normandy. Maybe Marshall wanted it or not. We don't know. He never put that on the record that I know.
He was too professional for that.
He was. Yeah. And of course, FDR had thought about it. I'm not saying he didn't consider it, but I don't know that it would have been that tenable. And I don't know that he would have had the same kind of cachet that Eisenhower had at that point, of someone who had known people in the Mediterranean, had worked with all these folks, versus Marshall kind of coming in cold. He had mainly dealt with the British equivalent to their Joint Chiefs of Staff, Brooke at the Chief of Imperial General Staff, so on and so forth. He'd not dealt with the operational commanders all that much. So I don't know that was ever much. What do you think?
He dealt with...
What do you think about it?
In a lot of ways, he dealt with a lot of logistics and high-up decisions, but he hadn't... he didn't have the battlefield smarts that Eisenhower had earned. I mean, Eisenhower wasn't a great battlefield commander when he started off, but he learned as he went. And I could be wrong about this, but I think Marshall, for the D-Day plan, wanted to drop the parachute units into Paris. And
not that far,
and that was
but he
just
wanted...
untenable. You couldn't do that.
He wanted multiple divisions, not in Paris, but probably about 40 miles from there, something like
Right.
that. And it's just simply not tenable. So it was an interesting dynamic because at that point, toward the end of 43, there's a big argument going on whether we ought to have airborne divisions as a whole after the whole Sicily debacle and all that. And Marshall's inclined to want divisions, of course, but Leslie McNair is a little bit skeptical. He's the head of Army Ground Forces, and they have this big maneuver in December of 43 at Knollwood in North Carolina. And, eventually it works out well and they keep the division. So, like Max Taylor, who becomes the 101st Airborne Commander, and Bill Lee before him, Ridgway, the 82nd, they're happy to get Marshall's support for the divisional concept because they get to continue as division commanders.
Yep.
But they're also a little bit like, whoa, let's pump the brakes on this whole drop us 60 miles from the landing beaches thing. They have to gently guide him away. I've always wondered what Marshall was thinking of that, because I don't think that was his usual clear thinking.
The thing that bums me out about this podcast is, like, I got a million more things to say about Marshall, and we really do need to move on. I'm going to say one last thing about the character of Marshall. When Roosevelt wrote that note to Stalin and said, okay, we've picked a commander to lead Overlord, and his name is Eisenhower, and he misspells it, of course, Marshall kept the note and gave it to Eisenhower. And I think that shows his character, and we will talk more about him in the future. What do you think, John?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that is his number one mentee, his number one protege, Eisenhower, of course. And I think that on some levels, think about the impact that had of Marshall identifying this guy as a younger officer, and then, talk about being promoted over others who were more senior, moving Eisenhower up through the ranks because he was at the War Plans Division, and then sending him to North Africa, so on and so forth, all that.
And that's a great story, which we'll talk about at a future date.
But think about what that means for the country going forward, all the impact that Eisenhower had, of course, militarily and then politically. Mm-hmm. Obviously, to this day, so that's enormously consequential. Now, we've talked about, Marshall's good sides, which is most of him. He's not perfect either, and one of the issues that when we look back now, he probably could have done a lot more on his race because he's from something of a Southern tradition, though he's not really a Southern segregationist or anything, and he certainly has, having been in Columbus, Georgia, for a good bit of his career, where, man, pretty hardcore segregation, in off post for soldiers at Fort Benning, so on and so forth. He's seen that, and he's an opponent of it, but he's not necessarily in World War II willing to stick his neck out and say, no, we're going to desegregate the Army, we're going to bring about change. He's primarily concerned with winning the war, of course. But he's not that into the social change.
But I have seen things in some of his letters that make me just, and we can talk about that the next time we visit General Marshall.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's so much to go with Marshall.
But right now, I feel like that you and I are just a pair of chumps, John.
Well, we're always a pair of chumps, and that's one of the many fun things about this podcast. People can try and stump these chumps with their own questions that we don't know beforehand.
That's right.
We are not given the questions. It's completely cold, so we don't claim to know everything. In my case, I know next to nothing, so I just follow Kevin's lead on most of these questions.
And I'm the Sergeant Schultz of answering. I know nothing. I see nothing.
I'm right with you.
For old.
All right, we got some good questions, John. Why don't you tell everyone out there how they can send us questions?
Absolutely. So please email your questions to, as you see there, WorldWar2Live@gmail.com. Again, that's WorldWar2Live@gmail.com, and it's 2 with a numeral.
Awesome. All right, send them in, and I will curate them, and we'll get them on the show. So we got some good questions today.
Good. I'm tired of all those bad questions.
Well, there you go. Field this one there, Keith. Keith says, did Hitler sire any children that survived his demise? And has modern DNA testing revealed any insights into Hitler, Himmler, Mengele, or their descendants?
Well, that's interesting because Adolf Hitler was asked that question, and he said, none that I know of. No, actually, no, not that I know of. No. And the DNA evidence question, I want to say that comes from a movie called The Boys from Brazil about cloning Hitler, which I think that was a pretty big movie when it came out in the early 1970s.
Yep.
Who were the other German officials mentioned?
Himmler.
No, no, and no. But I do know that there are descendants of, I think, of Hermann Goering and a few
And
others
Himmler.
that actually
There's family members
voluntarily
of him.
sterilized because they didn't want to have any further children because of being raised as being known as being these, the descendants of evil, I guess would be the nicest way I could put it. So, no, John, are you hiding any little Hitler Youths in your house that we don't know about?
Yeah, I can reveal that now. I've raised a little Hitler spawn here, and
Just add water.
No, there is. Hitler did not have any children. There's no evidence of that. He is, of course, he famously gets married only on the last day of his life to Eva Braun, but he did have a long-term relationship with her before that, and before that, his niece, his half-niece, Jelly Rabal, who committed suicide in 1931. It was a big scandal that really could have sunk Hitler's career. Unfortunately, it didn't. But Hitler's sexuality remains, of course, a major source of speculation and invention and whatever all these years later. But we can say with certainty that he did not have any children.
Right.
Heinrich Himmler, of course, has family members, of course, people who were related to him. Several years ago at the We Have Ways Festival in England, we had a fascinating talk from either his niece or his great niece. I apologize, I don't remember precisely which, but it was very interesting to hear her take. Of course, she obviously, as a kind of descendant, was horrified at what happened.
What Unky did.
She said, yeah, right. She said that even to this day, though, there's a divide in the family over the attitude about that, and it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. You would think it'd be universal. That's what Heinrich did was awful.
Did she look like Himmler at all? Did you see any facial recognition?
Fortunately for her, no. She did not, and she did not act or talk like Himmler. She was seemed to be a wonderful person. So, and of course, Joseph Goebbels, of course, had I think 6 kids, something like that. Who then, famously,
what happened to them, John?
He and his wife killed them in the bunker before they killed themselves.
None of those kids went to gymnasium or anything like that, did they?
Not in the long term, no.
I think in the early 90s, 60 Minutes did an episode about the descendants of Himmler and Goering and all that. And at that point, they were still kind of youngish people.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
And they were, really struggling with some difficult issues, as you can imagine.
Mm.
All right, let's see if we can get onto something a little more upbeat here. So this from Jim. He wants to know, can you speak about the Greek resistance during World War II and how it affected the course of the war? So my wife is half Greek, so I'm interested in hearing this answer.
Well, we're only going to give half an answer now.
Okay.
I know how to go first. I got some things
I'll
to say.
complete the other half. I'm not going to short you, Mark. I mean, I'm a little more professional than Kevin, I think. But it's a great question, Jim. There's a lot going on in Greece during the war.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, initially the Greeks are hoping to sit out the war, and then, famously Mussolini decides to invade in 1940, so on and so forth. So Greece is nominally conquered by, May 1941.
John, it's conquered by the Nazis. It's not conquered by the Italians. Don't the Italians get pushed back?
Yeah, they do initially, but eventually they're going to piggyback on the success of the German operations, and they will be part of the occupation of Greece. But whether the Germans and Italians can really control the country is very, very questionable. Similar to Yugoslavia, actually, where you've got a lot of partisan activity going on, and of course, like most every other country that's under Axis occupation, there's basically a civil war going on between those who are either accommodating, collaborating, profiting, whatever, from the foreign presence, and the majority who aren't. And that minority who are willing to stick their necks out and fight. So yes, you've got Greek partisan attacks, against Axis soldiers that go on through the whole war. And it's really quite unstable, and even Hitler recognizes this. By September 44, he decides to withdraw German troops, and of course by then Mussolini had fallen from Italy. The Italians were nominally out of the war too. So what happens then is it presages the Greek Civil War, which we heard the bit of Marshall's speech for the Marshall Plan. Of course, what had predated that was the Truman Doctrine, which is based on the Greek Civil War between communists and non-communists, and that I mention that because it germinates during World War II.
Just to add to what you're saying, John, from what I know about it, and I'm not a super scholar on it, it was a lot of the British were supporting the Greek resistance, and one of the problems with the resistance, not only is it those willing to fight and those not, but you've got people fighting for the crown, but then you also have partisan groups that are communist, and so you have conflict there. And so by the time you get to 1945 and the communists are really making strides, the British actually send combat troops into Greece to fight the Greeks. And this is going to become a big issue at Yalta, because when we start talking when Roosevelt and Churchill are talking to Stalin about Poland, and hey, we want Poland to be a democracy, we want to support it and everything, his kind of attitude is like, hey, I need a buffer, and I gave you guys Greece. Those were communist partisans that you guys killed, and I didn't give them any support. I let you knock them out. So you guys can have Greece, I'm taking Poland. And in the world of Cold War politics, that's how things were settled. A lot of people say, they abandoned Poland. It's like, well, we kind of did, but it was so that we could. But it was a quid pro quo almost.
And it was always going to be hard to have influence in Poland. And you remember the whole 90-10 spheres of influence thing,
Yep.
supposedly, and where obviously we have 90% of the influence in Greece or Belgium or whatever, and they have it in Poland.
Yep.
Well,
and another thing is we make the assumption that a lot of these small European countries in the eastern part of Europe that had formerly been the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that they're all democracies, and they weren't. They were feudal countries run by kings and queens, and so a lot of people said, we don't want that rule to come back. We want a democracy. We want communism. We want something other than that monarchical rule. And so that really, you kind of have to understand that to figure out the politics of Greece and a lot of those countries right in there.
Yeah, and to close the loop on it and build on your point about the British combat troops, so they're there after the war, including paratroopers.
Yep.
And so there's about 40,000 plus who are there after the war, and it's in 1947 that the British have notified the UN and, of course, the U.S. that they're going to have to pull their troops out, which tracks, of course, with the larger kind of economic and military decline Britain is experiencing at that point. And so that's when the problem is really thrown into Truman's lap to say, look, if we don't do something, the Greek communist partisans might take over, and they're getting outside help. The Soviets were funneling weapons through Yugoslavia and into Greece,
Yep.
so this becomes the whole kind of foundation for the Truman Doctrine or containment of communism at that point.
Cyprus is part of that too, right?
Yeah, because it's fought over by Greece and Turkey, like a lot of things.
Yep.
So yes, there's a conflict that goes on after the war and is still really not quite over.
And an American officer who lands on D-Day is the one that's going to lead this organization or this effort in the Mediterranean, in Cyprus, and that is James Van Fleet, right?
Yep, James Van Fleet. And speaking of that pertains to what we were talking about tonight with Marshall. So James Van Fleet,
kind of in reverse.
This is mind-blowing. Yeah, James Van Fleet was a member of the class of 1915. So that's Eisenhower's class, Bradley, And so all those guys are massive, powerful commanders on D-Day. He's a colonel in charge of the 8th Infantry Regiment, which leads the way at Utah Beach. It was said that Marshall had thought Van Fleet was an alcoholic because there was apparently a guy who named Van Fleet who had a terrible alcohol problem in the Army, and that it was a confusion of identities or something. I don't know if that's really true, but I do know that Van Fleet was serving way below his level, and by the end of the war, he's going to be a corps commander. Then he earns in stripes in Greece, and then, of course, he's going to succeed Ridgway as 8th Army commander in Korea.
I want to say it was Patton that told him that during Marshall's October 44 visit to the front. That he said, why haven't you promoted Van Fleet? He goes, well, because he's a drunk. He goes, no, he's not. You're mixing him up with somebody else. And suddenly his star is on the rise. So did we answer that question briefly and efficiently, Mark?
We'll go on all night. As
People
awesome.
do know what they're getting themselves into when they ask historians questions, right?
Yeah. Well, that was great. That was a really good Cold War answer. So I appreciate that. One thing I just want to make a point, right, is such as the question says, Greek resistance during the war, how it affects the course of the war. One thing I've always thought was that the Greeks fought so hard against particularly the Italians that's one of the reasons that Churchill wants to send troops to Greece. Mm-hmm. And the only troops available are in Africa. And so he strips the British army in Africa to go to Greece. And as soon as they leave, unfortunately, Rommel shows up. And Rommel's famed success right in the desert is because all the British troops went to Greece. And
certainly had an impact. Yeah.
It had an impact.
Also, too, it famously, in the spring of 1941, costs Hitler a lot of good campaign weather that he could have used in the Soviet Union.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, it takes, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, or whatever.
It's going to delay his invasion of the Soviet Union and make him run into general mud. Now, the troops I was talking about was 1945 that were going in there. This is a different point in the war when Churchill's tearing away troops, sending them, I think, even to Crete. Just anywhere there's a fire going off, he's like, I got to do something. And it's like a lot of times the British will have a victory, and then they're so spent, they lose all their troops, and Rommel can plow into them. So, very quick answer there. The answer to narrow down is yes.
Yes. All right. Let's change gears here with a question from Bruce. He says, can you elaborate on the North Platte Canteen? Please explain the industrial strikes that took place at home.
John, why don't you handle North Platte is a river in between Missouri and Kansas.
North Platte Canteen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we got our first stump.
I figured you guys would know this one.
Repeat the question. I'll make something up.
Yeah, maybe we didn't understand.
Can you elaborate about the North Platte Canteen? ? Please explain the industrial strikes that took place at home.
Strikes.
Strikes.
Not baseball, not bombers, but yes, labor strikes going on. John, I know about the Pullman strike in Philadelphia. I'm not as familiar with any strikes going on in the Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri area.
No, I just know that there's a lot of strikes nationwide before the war, especially when we're beginning that initial mobilization in 40 and 41.
Right.
That at that point, the government was using military forces to put down strikes, actually, even before we got in the war, much less after. And most famously, though, you're going to see strikes from like the United Mine Workers under a guy named John Lewis, who just gets this reputation for being an incredibly powerful and kind of contentious labor leader. And you absolutely have a serious problem during the war with labor, with labor strikes and whatnot.
And a lot of these, like the Pullman strike that goes on in Philadelphia, the root of it is America's biggest, shame and problem. It's because white Pullman drivers, train drivers, or trolley drivers did not want to work with blacks, and that leads to violence. But there's such a labor need, so I don't know if that played into the Platte plant strike. But that's an area where a lot of B-29 bombers were built. But like I said, during the war, I'm really not familiar with many strikes. It's everybody was kicking in for the war effort, and
well, they were, but there were a lot of strikes, and man, soldiers resented it big time.
Yeah.
And so there was a perception among the soldiers that many members of labor unions were really unpatriotic, and so the soldiers' point of view was, they've uprooted. They're away from their family. In the case of some of them, they're in great danger.
Living in mud
here
and
are these
sand
guys back.
and snow.
Yeah, I mean, here are these guys back home, with 3 squares a day, living at home and with their family and making more money than they ever did, and they're still going on strike. So it's a factor in why there's a big backlash against labor unions after the war. And the Taft-Hartley Act is passed in 1947, which tries to end what are called closed shops, meaning certain jobs you have to join the labor union, like pipe fitter, plumber, whatever. That's certainly a factor. And, Truman tried to veto that, and Congress overrode his veto. So that tells you how popular Taft-Hartley was and how much pent-up anger there was against labor unions.
Yep. Mark, add anything you want there.
Okay, well, I did some real-time Googling, right? Because we are in the 2025, 21st century.
John, why didn't you think of that?
And I'm not even a millennial or anything, so that's incredible.
Proud of you.
Siri.
You're really modern.
Thank you. So apparently this was a 2-part question, because the North Platte Canteen was also known as the Servicemen's Canteen, and it was a railroad stop served by local citizens of North Platte, Nebraska, from Christmas Day 41 to April 1st, 46. Its purpose was to provide refreshment and hospitality to soldiers who were traveling through the area on their way to war. During its run, nearly 55,000 Nebraska women served almost 7 million soldiers on their way to fight World War II.
Well, that would be encouraging, not a cause for a strike, but go on.
Yeah.
Well, and
that's
that's
it. Yeah. That's it. It's a famous canteen where.
Oh,
these
wait,
women
now I
famous
remember
one
the
was the
story.
Stage Door Canteen.
They played a pickup game of baseball there, and this guy was throwing a lot of balls and then threw a strike. So there's the story.
Okay.
Very famous. I think it was.
His velo was up. His velo was up big time.
His name was
Yeah,
Roy
he did
Hobbs.
98
He was the best I'd ever seen.
And he struck out the whammer.
He was a natural.
He was a natural.
God, all these old
fireworks
men
when he
jokes.
played.
Like people are like, what's the natural?
Well, according to this, one of the most important jobs of these women volunteers was to answer questions, like you gentlemen, including those surrounding the canteen and the basics of the North Platte and Nebraska. Another important job was to tend those in the hospital trains.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
They probably did a better job answering questions than we did, I suspect.
Probably did a better job taking care of wounded soldiers on trains than we would too.
Absolutely.
So I mean,
Mark, for the love of God, ask us the next question. So embarrassed.
That's three. So you got 2 strikes on that one.
Wow.
That was good. I have to say though, I'd never heard of the North Platte Canteen,
Oh, you lose
and
it.
when I saw the question, I was like, well, I guess John and Kevin will know. They're brilliant.
What did we disappoint
What could
you?
possibly
Wow.
go wrong?
But
Get used to it.
I mean,
It's going to happen a lot.
I guess,
Get used to
I guess we're
Yeah.
proving we don't have any ringers here, do we?
it. Yeah.
This really is. We do not know the questions before they come, do we, John?
I
really
think
don't.
this goes to show like how many stories there were in World War II.
Oh,
There's
oh,
like
yeah. Billion.
in millions, and so many of them are being lost.
Yep.
So thank you.
Well, that's what John and I do all day. We try to keep them and try to remind people.
Yeah.
You know.
Yep.
All right, give us an easy one, damn it.
That's it. We have 3. We're only doing. Do you want another one? I can get you another one. Let me see what we
Well, we got to end on a positive note here.
Let's get one more that maybe
Yeah.
we'll know.
Okay.
What grade did Patton get in math in high
usual.
school? You know, like.
I
I was on a tour one time and someone asked, I said, any questions? Someone said, yeah, do you know how much Patton's household sold for in California last month? No.
All right, here you go.
Check Zillow.com.
I'm not a real estate historian. And if I was, I would be a miserable person. Okay, Mark, come on.
Carlo
Well, you
Diaz
guys,
could
you
answer
know
that,
anything about
Kevin.
engineering combat battalions?
I know a little
We
bit.
can try.
yes.
Okay. Well, Lynn.
I know more about them than I know about Platte Canteen.
All right. Well, Lynn wants to know: movement in the ETO depended hugely on rapid bridge building. Did the engineer combat battalions get adequate training in U.S. schools? How many different bridge types did they build? What rivers in the U.S. did they practice on? Wow.
They got extensive training, excellent training, and they were pretty well equipped too. Of course, the famous bridging is the Bailey Bridge that can hold up to 40 tons of vehicles. I mean, there would not have been a tremendous diversity in the equipment they have, but they were in many cases lavishly equipped. But I should say, there's all these different kinds of engineering units. So a unit with that kind of bridging equipment may not be, classically speaking, an engineer combat battalion, which is more focused, on mines and booby traps and bulldozing and that kind of mission that's very, very close to the infantry and whatever else. So that was the amazing thing about the Allied or the American war effort in particular. All this diversity of engineering that you've got. Aviation engineers is another really good example. Sometimes they're doing bridging too, but usually building airfields. But from Sicily onward in the ETO, bridge building is absolutely huge, and we become so good at it that there's no peer at all. And same thing in the Pacific Theater too.
And West Point, really the only degree you could get there for a long time was engineering. And when you've graduated from West Point, the smartest guys went into engineering, because not only is that good for the Army, but then you could get the most highest paid jobs working for railroad companies and, building companies because they desperately need professional engineers. As far as equipment, there's just so many different levels of bridges. There's the famous Bailey Bridge. There's pontoon bridges, treadway bridges. There was an interesting anecdote I came across in some of my research. When we had, John, what's the port north of Antwerp? The port of Antwerp, when that was opened up.
Yeah.
And bridging equipment would come through for First Army. Patton had an officer up there who would write with chalk on any bridging equipment, Third Army. And that equipment would work its way to the front. And when it got to Liège, General Hodges had an officer erasing Third Army and sending it back to First. So Hodges kind of learned from the master Patton how to play the game about bridging. But what they do with bridging is amazing, how quickly they throw up bridges. There was a case in, I want to say it was near Metz, that the Germans knock out a bridge, and the engineers come to Patton and they said, listen, it's going to take us a couple of days to do this. And Patton says, no, you're going to work through the night, and you're going to get this bridge done, because that's the only way to get our wounded out, really. And so they said, but, working at night, we're going to need big strobe lights and everything, and the Luftwaffe can just pummel us. And he said, no, use the strobe lights. I'm going to send extra battalions of anti-aircraft guns to be on both sides of that bank. And that's exactly what happens. The bunch of Luftwaffe bombers and fighters come in. They shoot almost all of them down. And that bridge is completed in 24 hours, and the trains are rolling.
Amazing.
And so it's just like you just give the engineers, tell the engineers what you need, and they'll have it done in 24 to 48 hours. They really were amazing at what they did. As for training in the States, John, I don't know about that. I would imagine you're looking at training in the South, where most of our troops are trained. I don't know that we had a particular fort for training engineers. But I can imagine the millions of bayous and small rivers across the South. I know that in the Louisiana maneuvers and the Tennessee maneuvers in 41, that engineers are constantly building bridges during all of that. But I don't know an exact location of a training place for engineers in World War II.
Yeah, I mean, it's just whatever river would be on whatever post where you're training. I mean, so I don't think it's like, the big river systems, Mississippi, Ohio, or whatever, where they're going to exclusively do that. It's whatever is on the military posts or where the maneuvers are taking place. And, of course, at Fort Lewis, too, in the Pacific Northwest, same deal there. I mean, you name it. Speaking of the bridging, the last point I'll make about this. So when the Americans invaded Luzon in January 1945, during the advance to Manila, there were 217 bridges out over, streams, rivers, swamps, water sources in between. So think of all the bridging that engineers had to do over that, 3-4 week period, something like that. It's absolutely incredible.
And then I'll conclude just, I'm really glad somebody asked that question. Was that Lynn? Because you can never give enough love to the engineers for what they did and the sacrifices they gave. and so much love is given into the armor and the airborne and the infantry. And our friend Joe Bolkowski made a really good point that the history of engineers on D-Day at Omaha Beach will probably never be written because so many engineers were killed coming ashore that day. And so, obviously we think of Omaha Beach, we think of the infantry. No, tons of engineers there sacrificing themselves to get supplies and things up on the shore. So I'll end with that. So thank you, Lynn.
1 out of every 4 American soldiers that came ashore that day at Omaha Beach was an engineer.
Boom.
To build on your point.
Yep.
Exactly.
That's a mic drop right there, John. Oh, thank you for saving us, Lynn, after the Platte Canteen question.
So, Kevin, what you?
I'll tell you what have I been up to? I'll tell you what I did, what I was up to. I recently, for Memorial Day, which was Monday, I went to the Soldiers and Airmen's Home Cemetery in Washington, D.C. This cemetery is probably well known because when it filled to capacity, that's when they created Arlington National Cemetery, because during the Civil War in 1864, the local cemeteries filled up. I think there's about, it's not 200, but there's about 100 Medal of Honor recipients buried there. General Logan, who was part of Sherman's Atlanta campaign, he later becomes the head of the Army of the Republic, which is basically the big lobbying or a veterans group post-Civil War, and he declares Decoration Day, May 30th, I think it's 1868, which is going to become Memorial Day. So he is entombed in a crypt there. And a friend of mine, Rod Gaynor, who is the curator at Arlington National Cemetery, he gave a speech there about Memorial Day and the dead that are buried there from all the wars. And Rod Ross, who used to be an archivist at the National Archives, read out the order. And it was just a very nice way to spend the day, at least the morning. They opened up Logan's Crypt and people got to go in. And most of the people in the audience, there were about 70 people. A lot of them live in the old soldiers' home there. And it was nice that when the ceremony ended, a lot of them just kind of wandered into the cemetery to visit friends, because the only people that can be buried there are the residents of the Soldiers and Airmen's Home. So that's what I was up to. What about you, John?
Wow. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Just finished reading a really interesting book by Adam Higginbotham about the Challenger, about the Challenger disaster in 1986.
The O-ring.
Yeah, I think it would. Yeah, exactly. I think it would really interest you, and it's just such a well-researched book. From a lot of different levels, from the archival level, from the interview level, the memory level, the family level. I mean, you name it. It's really a very thorough book, and it's a kind of cautionary tale about decision making at a high level, and how dysfunctional it truly was that ultimately leads to that disaster. So you don't even have to be interested in the space program in particular. Maybe if you're interested in the dynamics of human leadership and decision making, and of course defense contractors or government contractors, and how that whole dynamic plays out, and how this ultimately costs the lives of some pretty remarkable people. Yeah. Really, really fascinating book.
And John, the author, is he a scientist or an officer who is involved in the examination, or is he just an historian? I shouldn't say just an historian.
He's just an historian like us. So
the lowest level, right there, was shoe salesman, yeah.
We are, and nothing against shoe salespeople, because they're the greatest.
Yeah,
so,
Al Bundy.
Absolutely. Al Bundy was a good salesman, too, in his own way, wasn't he? Well, it's been fascinating. George Marshall, Al Bundy, everything in between. This is World War II Live. Anything could happen here. So, been a lot of fun. Appreciate all of you joining us today. Please like and subscribe, follow us, and of course send us questions so that we can be stumped, because we are chumps. Send us questions at WorldWar2Live@gmail.com. Again, that's WorldWar2Live@gmail.com. As you see, the 2 is a numeral. So, thanks for joining us, everybody. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, buddy.
Roger out.